Okay, I'd like to start the next session, if that's okay. Today, I'm going to talk about AI for science, and it's from the big data that you get from the big experimental facilities at for example, the Department of Energy labs in the US, where they have synchrotrons and lasers and neutron sources. So big data comes from the large-scale facilities, and we're going to apply AI techniques to see if we can improve science. First of all, I'd like just to rehash a little bit about what's happened in the last 10 years. So there has actually been a revolution because machine learning methods are a subset of AI technologies, but they're the ones that are most relevant at the moment for what we're doing with the experimental data at these laboratories. And there are many methods, but neural networks is in red because in 2012 there was what has been called the deep learning revolution, because there were methods using neural networks where you model artificially a neural network like you have in the brain, but a very simplified version. And you have input layers and output layers, and you train the connections and the strengths so you can actually recognize a number plate or a person or things like that. And so these have been used for 20-odd years. But what happened in 2012 was that they realized the power, when you have enough data, you can put many layers, and that would transform the way you do certain challenges in image analysis. So this is a slide by Andrew Ng, who's one of the researchers who started this field at Stanford. And the other machine learning methods are just fine, but when the data gets more and more data, only deep learning seems to continue to improve. So you had to get enough data before you could see the advantages of these neural networks. And then this was the breakthrough, was a set of images which were collected by Professor Fei Li up in Stanford. And the images had all been tagged, so you could say that there was a cow, a car, a person, a building, and they all had labels on. And then computer scientists were working on computer vision systems, and what they were trying to do was assess which is the best vision system. And so they set up a competition using this data set, and images were classified, and could your computer vision recognize a cat from a dog? Could it recognize a poodle from a Labrador, and things like this? And so that was the test. And so they tested these computer vision systems, and it brought the community together and improved their computer vision systems. And typically they made a 1 or 2% a year, until in 2012 there was a 10% drop in 1 year. And that is the beginning of what we see as the deep learning revolution. Here, in order to do this, they use multiple hidden layers on the neural network, and furthermore they use special processors for doing the analysis, called graphical processing units. And these were the number of entries that use graphical processing units. And as more and more people started using neural networks, you have increased use of GPUs. And so this now is a way that you can get down to human error rates. This is the error rates in recognizing the images. And now you train it on these labeled data sets, and you use it on the unlabeled. And now you can get down with networks which have over 100 hidden layers. You can get down to human error rates for recognizing these things. And that's why the people in the IT industry were extremely excited. So the IT industry is going to pursue these things, and they have three big advantages over academia. First of all, they have huge data sets about all of us here, which they're never going to make open and share, but big data is important. Secondly, they have large numbers of people with PhDs in computer science and software engineering who can actually do machine learning and do AI techniques and write software. And lastly, their last advantage is they essentially have unlimited, in these big data centers, they have unlimited computing power. And so what the IT companies are doing, they're pursuing commercial opportunities, for example, image recognition for autonomous vehicles, facial recognition, these things. So for image recognition, I think there's really, unless you have a particular angle, it's very difficult for academia to compete. And similarly, deep learning methods have transformed natural language processing and machine translation. And they obviously have commercial interests. So again, unless academia has some particular sort of niche area, I think there's no point in trying to compete in these areas. Which brings us to AI for science. So I work at one of the UK's national labs. We have two, one up near Manchester and one near Oxford. I work near Oxford, and it is the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory. This is what it looks like. And it has these big facilities that are too big for universities to actually purchase themselves. And so they have, for example, one of the largest synchrotrons in the world that makes X-rays. They have a neutron source which creates neutrons scattering off materials. They have a laser facilities which has things like petawatt lasers and so on. And in addition, they have electron microscopy, which is now also revolutionizing the field of proteomics. The computing department where I live is here, and we have the particle physicists send data from CERN. They have large amounts of data, petabytes of data they transfer from CERN, and they store and analyze it in this building. And we also store the environmental data for the IPCC and all the satellite data for climate change and so on. So there's an environmental center as well as a particle physics center. And this is what the site looks at. And we have a group, a scientific machine learning group, which is looking at data coming from each of these sources and trying to see, can we do science? Can we help the scientists do the data? Because nowadays, instead of going home with their, with their data on a USB stick, it's now much too big to take home on a USB stick, so they have to take it on disks, and then there's nowhere to store it, and can they analyze it? It's a complicated thing, and so scientists are now becoming overwhelmed by the amount of data generated by these facilities. And this is an example of a facility that they have in the UK. There are similar facilities in the US at Berkeley, Argonne, Oak Ridge, Brookhaven, for example, and similarly all over Europe and Asia. So these is the way that experimental science is going, big data. How can you help scientists analyze and find new scientific results in their data? So we support a system. I mentioned the fact that they use GPUs. We have now, thanks to working with the Alan Turing Institute, which is the national AI institute in the UK, we now provide them with a service on these GPUs, which is ideal for doing this machine learning, this deep learning on this type of data. And so we run a computing service on these very powerful boxes which are full of GPUs. And that's used by anybody who works with Turing. So let's just give a couple of examples. I'll give 3 examples. One is from neutron scattering. And neutrons, you put various materials in, and you can look at the scattering, you can look at inelastic scattering, you can look at magnetic scattering. And so the example we're looking at is trying to distinguish different spin orientations of the material we're looking at. And this is important to understand quantum materials, but it's actually a very complex thing. And scientists have spent a long time trying to understand the data that they're generating, and so we thought we'd see if we can do something using machine learning, deep learning methods. And so here is an example of the images you get, and then these are the various layers of the neural network. It's a convolutional neural network, and we're trying to find out the values of these parameters in this Hamiltonian describing the system. And what you find is you can do that, and you can actually train the network using simulated data. and then you can actually do it on the real data and find the values of these parameters. And the values of the parameters that you can determine are quite close to the ones that have been observed experimentally. What I should point out, however, is that scientists like to have confidence in their results, and they express them with error bars. And so what we're not good at the moment with machine learning networks is understanding the uncertainties and the errors. So you notice these numbers, which we've determined, don't have error bars to them. And we'd like to understand the networks better so we can do that. Also, how do they work? Well, what you can also do is you can find out which are the important areas in the data that help you discriminate between this model or that model, for example. And this is an example that we did using these activation maps. And you find that these were the areas we picked out in the data, and they were the same areas that had been found several years before after a very painstaking effort and discovery by trained scientists in neutron scattering. So in principle, you can reproduce the results that people have got very much more easily. Now we wish to do more on that, and that's just beginning to try and understand how these networks arrive at their results. This is cryoelectron microscopy. It was the subject of a Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, and it is revolutionizing many aspects of protein structures. If you have a protein that crystallizes, you can find its structure using X-ray scattering, like at a synchrotron. But there are many types of proteins that are difficult to crystallize. For example, human membrane proteins are relatively difficult. And this is another technique. Instead of scattering X-rays of it, you look at individual molecules with an electron microscope. And so here, it's like an ice tray. You put the sample in there and you freeze it, and then you look at individual molecules with your electron microscope, and you get lots of little images, very faint images. And then you have a large number of graduate students who actually pick the best candidates because you don't know the orientation of the molecule that you're looking at. It might be this way, might be that way, might be this way. And so you can actually try and separate them out into good candidates, and from that you can produce a course map, and then from that, remarkably, you can produce a very detailed structure. And so that was that whole pipeline of work was awarded the Nobel Prize, the inventors of that. But one of the hold-ups now, because the detectors have got much better, so instead of getting megabits a second, you went to gigabits a second, and now you're getting hundreds of gigabits a second of data, so you get a lot of data. And the bottleneck is how, for example, this is very manual. Can you automate that? And that's one use of a neural network. People are trying to automate that part. And what we're trying to do at the Rutherford Lab is look at the whole scheme, looking at various efforts, looking at correcting for noise, particle picking I talked about, then you have reconstruction, looking at secondary structures, and then actually going from these things to actual detailed molecular structures. And so each of those efforts has opportunities for using AI techniques, and that's what we're trying to do in that space. To take another one, I talked about the environmental data center where there's a special machine called Jasmine, which is a data-centric parallel computer, and what they're doing there is looking at data coming from a satellite. And these new satellites, Sentinel-3, this particular satellite, they generate petabytes of data a year, and they have various sensors on them, and we're looking at this SLSTR, Sea and Land Surface Temperature Radiometer, and as you can see that they go around the Earth every 1 or 2 days. And so we're trying to see if we can detect whether it's really cloud, whether it's a reflection from the sea or from ice, whether it's sandstorms or whatever. And so to do that, you use a thing called UNet, which is a traditional convolutional neural network, and you can actually configure that to look at these images. But just like in the ImageNet example, you need a training set to train your network on. So what we've been doing is, this is the actual image of the Arabian Peninsula, this is the Red Sea, this is real cloud, this is a sandstorm. And so what they traditionally use is a sort of Bayesian method to do it, and that is what they start with, the Bayesian mask, and it confuses the sandstorm with cloud and reflections from the sea. And in this particular example, we've managed to have train a neural network to do somewhat better. It gets rid of the sea, it gets rid of the sandstorm, and it does recognize the cloud. So this is just the beginning of seeing if we can do better at cloud masking determination. Okay, so those are just some of the examples, and there are many other examples from all the data that we collect at the lab. And it's being done also at the US labs around the US. But there are some challenges. So this is just to show you a couple of them. This is called adversarial noise. This is a picture of a panda. You've trained it by showing it thousands of pictures of pandas, and so it will recognize that's a panda. If you sprinkle a bit of noise on it, to me, it looks just like a panda, but now the system is fooled and thinks it's a gibbon, all right? So these things can be easily, you train them on many, many images, yet if you put a bit of noise on in the right way, you can confuse the system. They're very brittle. Maybe that doesn't matter in the case of pandas, but in self-driving cars, it will matter. So you can train it by showing it stop signs, and the car will stop. But then if you put patches on it in various places, you will find the car just goes straight through. It thinks it's a 45 mile per hour, all right? So they can have serious consequences, and it's quite clear that these methods don't have any semantic understanding. They don't understand STOP means stop, and what stop means. It has no understanding of that. So this is just one example of many types of brittleness of these AI applications. And so we need to do better. So what we're trying to do then is, from our experiments, get some open data sets which are curated. We know what the ground truth is, and then we want to actually experiment with different machine learning methods, different types of networks, what works best, what works not at all, when should you use deep learning, when is it no use. And so we want to understand the strengths and applicability of different methods, and also, do you need to have a GPU, or do you need Google's tensor processing unit, or whatever? So we would like to understand the performance on different hardware and also the different algorithms. So that's one thing we're trying to do with these data sets, which we can make open and, if you like, benchmarks for scientific machine learning. And in addition, because we have control over this data sets and we can actually do the experiments, we'd like to understand about the uncertainties I've told you and the robustness, and also the explainability. Can we understand how it comes to its decision? Because scientists are very conservative. They like error bars, they like uncertainty quantification, they like to know how it got to its result. And they won't accept these technologies unless we can show that. So I talked about why I don't think it's very sensible for academia to try and compete in the main areas, autonomous vehicles, natural language processing, and so on, because that's a commercial thing, and the companies have really all the aces in their hands. But one of the things we can do here is we can try and do machine learning with constraints from science, physical constraints, symmetry constraints, biology constraints, chemical constraints. And so exploring these machine learning algorithms in the presence of physical constraints. And so that's really an exciting thing. And one of the examples is Google's UK subsidiary called DeepMind have produced a tool called AlphaFold. And this is protein structure prediction. There's a competition run by David Baker, who is at the University of Washington stand over there, and Google entered that competition every 2 years, and they won the competition this year. So they came out of nowhere, and there were all these teams, and they won the competition using protein structure prediction, which based on on lots of physics and biology, but also on machine learning to actually evaluate potentials and so on. So the question that excites me is, can we find new scientific tools that can do better than anybody else's by using these deep learning? Can we actually accelerate the process of science? It's sometimes said that people go and take data at these facilities, and they take so much data that they can't look at it all, and a small proportion only is used of that. So can we make our science more efficient? Can we make it more easy to find out new scientific results about materials, about proteins, about drugs? And this is the challenge. And this is, to me, a very exciting challenge. And what we're trying to do at the lab is connect all the pieces. So this is the computing lab where we work. This is the synchrotron with X-rays. This is next door, the lab next door, where they do fusion. This is the European Jet Fusion tokamak. This is our supercomputer up at our Daresby lab near Manchester. This is the laser physics, and this is the neutron sources. Can we put all those together using intelligent AI systems to make the whole of the process work together well? Because people are doing experiments now where they look at it with X-rays, they look at it with neutrons, and they may look at it with supercomputing simulations. And can you put all that information together and get new science? And that's the challenge, I think, for all the labs around the world. And we're actually very keen to try and make a contribution in the UK. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions? Roscoe. Okay, so the question is, do I anticipate that the capabilities of AI alter what things you take, measurements you take? I think that's conceivable, yes. I mean, the particle physics are trying to do jet detection, as you know, and they're using deep neural networks to try and do that. And maybe they'll decide they want to take some slightly different data sets from their trigger data sets. So I think it is possible we'll get insights by machine learning being able to do certain things well that we haven't been able to do before. Yeah. Yes. You were listening. I'm very impressed. No, it's a good question, because on the ImageNet example, the key thing was that Fei-Fei Li, the professor at Stanford, had paid for humans in Mechanical Turk to annotate the images. And so you knew what the ground truth is. When the data comes off the machine, it doesn't come annotated. And so what's the ground truth? And we have to find some way of doing that. You can get graduate students to do it, but there's a lot of data. So what people are doing, the particle physics, for example, and the astronomers, they're using simulated data, what they think the data will look like. And so they can train it, and when they get real data, they can go and see if they see the effect they expect. But of course, if they see something surprising, you might worry what they will actually interpret. So I think there are challenges with that. I absolutely agree. But it's called supervised learning, where you have a training set. And can you do semi-supervised? Can you use other methods of doing it? These are frontier. Can you do unsupervised learning? Well, you can find some things, but there are many challenges, and using simulated data comes with caveats. I absolutely agree. I think you've been very patient. Thank you very much for listening.